Good morning, Excellencies, distinguished participants and students from my international relations class. Warm welcome to everyone this morning. It's refreshing, it's really a bit of a treat this morning to be having a public forum in person with proper distancing measures, hygienic standards, and to have this public forum live in the flesh is quite a treat, and it's a good change of pace. Another good change of pace is that we don't have to talk so much about Thailand this morning, and I intend not to. Of course, Thailand is part of ASEAN, part of the Indo-Pacific, right smack in the center of the Indo-Pacific. But much of the world is focused on who's going to win the election in the U.S. next week. Much of Thailand is wondering what's going to happen to Thailand. But this morning we are focus on what's going to happen to the Indo-Pacific region, and what role should Germany play in it in view of the European Union, and also what would be the perspectives or the responses and views from, let's say, India, which is really the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific, and the ASEAN, which is also a center or kind of a center of gravity of the Indo-Pacific in many ways. I'll just say first, before I want to also extend my warm welcome and appreciation to all the speakers, Ambassador Georg Schmidt of Germany, Ambassador Pirkka Tapiola of the European Union, Ambassador Suchitra of India, and then my colleague, Dr. Kasirat Chipensuk from the International Relations Department, Faculty of Political Science. The Indo-Pacific has had a relatively short history. You can say long, you can also say short. But I think in the frame that we're looking at this morning, it's not that long. You can trace it back to 2006, 2007. I think Prime Minister Abe Shinzo was the first really to come up with an Indo-Pacific outlook in a coherent, cogent, comprehensive fashion. 2006, 2007, the first Abe administration. He promoted a kind of a trilateral security dialogue with the US and Australia, eventually expanding to include India. It became quadrilateral, and the Quad now are the leading countries of the Indo-Pacific. But after the Abe kind of launch of the Indo-Pacific strategy, the United States got onto it, and President Donald Trump seized the Indo-Pacific and expanded into the free and open Indo-Pacific, FOIP. In 2017, he came, that year, Philippines was the chair of ASEAN. He came to the region. Only time I think he made that long trip, a 10-day trip, went to Vietnam, went to Philippines, and then started talking about a free and open Indo-Pacific. This is about September, October, November, second half of 2017. And then FOIP was enshrined, codified into the U.S. national security strategy, U.S. national defense strategy. It became the U.S. geostrategy for the world for engaging in foreign policy. So FOIP then is the frame for the U.S. And then I think we have to also address the aims of the FOIP. I think by consensus now, by all accounts, this is the U.S. came up with the FOIP with China in mind. So it's a way of checking China, and this is after China's aggressive expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative, checking and also in a way maybe constraining if possible, and countering maybe if necessary. So checking, constraining, countering FOIP vis-a-vis BRI. And then I notice now everybody is coming to the Indo-Pacific. Everybody who is anybody, every country that is any major country, France is returning, quote unquote, returning to the Indo-Pacific. The UK, of course, via India, now wants to be fully engaged in the Indo-Pacific. And most recently, Germany has come up with the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think it's a 70-page report. It's very comprehensive. It runs the gamut of all kinds of cooperation mechanisms and schemes. And I noticed, I think India was mentioned maybe more than 50 times. So, very significant how the Germany outlook on the Indo-Pacific place India at the center of it. And then the ASEAN was mentioned 66 times. 66 times for ASEAN. That's a lot. But among the ASEAN countries, Vietnam was mentioned 21 times. That's a lot. That's a lot for one 70-page document. Mentioned Vietnam 21 times. I won't say how many times it mentioned Thailand. Not as many as Vietnam. So, that's a way of kind of setting the scene. The Indo-Pacific is the name of the game. It's the game in town now. Everyone wants to come. All the major powers. Even if President Trump loses the election next week, I think that a Biden administration would have a fairly similar posture and outlook towards the region. The Indo-Pacific, the FOIP, most likely FOIP will not be retained in full fashion under a Biden administration. But in practice, it will be something, I think, similar in terms of pushing back or dealing or keeping an eye on China. So even if Biden wins, I think we're looking at this for the long term. It might not be called FOIP, but the Indo-Pacific frame itself, I think, will be long-lasting. So on that note, I think we sent some of the background materials to our guests and our panelists, and I'll just start with the German perspective. Germany is in the EU, but Germany also has its own engagements with the Indo-Pacific region, and now Germany has come up with a whole outlook, Indo-Pacific strategy, and I think Germany faces a similar dilemma, if I may say, Ambassador Schmidt, of the major powers of how to deal with this region with China in mind, and there's a bit of a intersection between security interests and economic interests. More than half of the EU exports to China come from Germany. But yet, China is a country that we regard with some trepidation around this region because of the South China Sea tensions, the artificial islands, and the problematic code of conduct, and so on. So let me just pass the microphone to you, Ambassador Schmidt, maybe for 15 minutes. Tell us a little bit about Germany's view and outlook and engagement and intentions in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you very much, and thank you for convening this, and I see a lot of ambassadorial colleagues, but most important, like the students in Chulalongkorn. So glad that you are here and glad that you make the time for it. When I started dealing as a student with the region here, and it was my strong intention, and I studied a lot about it, it was always called Asia-Pacific. And I think it's very important that we do this shift, that we call it Indo-Pacific, because when I studied in China and I lived around the area, but there was a sort of a mental separation between Far Eastern, China, Japan, Korea, and then we had a very different community of people who dealt with South Asia, India, Sri Lanka, the Bay of Bengal. But historically speaking, I'm speaking under the control of the Indian ambassador, this is a region that belongs together, that has historically always belonged together for trade, economics, culture. I do not need to say this in Thailand, but we need to say this quite often in Germany. There is nothing, there is much more that connects the countries and the cultures than that separates them. So for us, it's a new departure to actually see it, but one should not say, oh, this means that we're following the American guideline or other guidelines. So this, as a beginning, why is it called the Indo-Pacific Guidelines? It's not a strategy, it's guidelines. It reads softer, but it's an attempt by Germany to define what do we want to achieve in the region. Why policy guidelines and why now? you made it much easier for me because you already went to the history of it, and Germany is the second country in Europe who has these guidelines, and we are in a different position from France because we're not an Indian or Pacific power. People keep forgetting that France has more than 1.5 million French citizens actually living in the region and French territory, so it's a very different approach, but the region matters enormously to us. You mentioned trade, you mentioned politics. If I just look, I mean, with China and India, the two most populous countries on earth, if we don't engage in a very constructive way, there's no way that we can address any of the global challenges that we need to address. And I'll be coming back to climate change later. So we do have an Africa strategy, Africa guidelines, Latin America. So there was a lot of pressure in Germany to say, where do you stand with regard to this region which is so important to us? Now, to take you a little bit through these guidelines are a long, drawn-out interagency discussion process. They're not as scientific as maybe a political scientist would hope for. So please do not count how many times do you mention country A and country B and make it up, because all the different line ministries contribute to it. And it's very helpful as a thought process also internally for us in Germany. So that we say, where do we stand? What are our interests? What are our possibilities? Where do we want to go? And that this is something which is then approved by the cabinet. We discussed it in parliament. We discussed it also with the other stakeholders, for instance, economic stakeholders and others. And it gives them an idea that we take a picture and say, this is what we're seeing now. It's a momentary picture, but it's done. It should be detailed enough that it makes sense, but it should be loose enough that you don't have to rewrite it every 3 to 4 years, because it takes a long time to do so. And for us, a couple of points, if you do take the time to read the whole document, are quite important. You will find a lot of multilateralism. And to us, multilateralism really matters. We do want to support people and everybody who says we live in a rules-based order. And these are rules-based, international rules-based, that we shape all of us. And they apply to all countries, regardless of their size. So we do have an alliance for multilateralisms, but we also are strong believers in the other fora that we have. We have the G20, the G7, we have the United Nations, and whatever you can criticize about the United Nations and the 75th anniversary, if we didn't have it, we would have to invent something about it, and we are ready to take more responsibility. As was said before, some of our most important trading partners, China, Japan, India, are in the region. And it's a very dynamic region, and our wealth is interlocked with the wealth and the development of the region. It is very clear. And also our trade is mostly conducted by sea. That's why we say it's very important to have open access to the sea according to international norms and standards. So stability and security in the whole region are of particular importance to us. And we need to explain that to our own population in Germany when they say, why should we care about what's happening in an ocean that is thousands and thousands of kilometers away from us? It does matter. I think the region has an outstanding science and research center, and culturally it's very rich, so we want to strengthen also. You will see in the paper there are guidelines that cover a lot what we want to do also in science. And but we also see that there's an increasing confrontation between China and the US. And this causes enormous strains. Again, I do not need to explain that here, but it causes also risks, and these risks need to be managed properly. And as I said, as one important point, pollution. And here we have two issues which are interlinking, pollution in terms of climate change, but also in actual pollution. And Thailand was very active in that during its ASEAN presidency. So what do the guidelines aim to? They want to affirm that Germany has really a shared resolve to engage even more actively as an actor and partner in the region. And we want to help maintain the rules-based order here. We want to offer a coherent policy framework internally. This is what we want to do. There are diverse points of departure for closer cooperation, if you look at it. We want to definitely look to flank the commitment of the European Union in the Indo-Pacific Union. So many people have said, why no EU strategy? Why is Germany going it alone? If you read in the guidelines, we hope that we would push towards and contribute towards a discussion which has to be a discussion in Brussels amongst all the member states. We know that this, at the end of the day, has to come into a EU-led and EU also approved process. And here maybe some of the differences to other guidelines. We do not exclude any partners in our guidelines, and they are not directed against China. This is important for us. We include all partners, and we do not want to see bipolar structures being entrenched in the region. We feel that no country should actually be forced to choose sides between one side or the other. And this choice, I think, is an important question for countries in ASEAN, but it is an important choice for us in Germany as well, since we're so far away. If you look at the Huawei debate and others, it's a choice which we want to remain, and we want to cooperate with everybody to have as much policy space for not being forced to do a sort of choice. It's either one or, because there might be multiple reasons and choices to say, in this area we cooperate with this partner, in that area we cooperate with another partner, for a set of clear criteria. We do also want to see diversification. We see that with the political tension, there are economic and political risks, so we should not put our eggs all in one basket. This is primarily directed towards our business community. And Germany is not a state-controlled economy, so we cannot tell our businesses what to do, but we can encourage them. And I think ASEAN might profit a lot from it, that people just say, look, let's rather diversify our value chains and not only produce in China or in other countries. And it has triggered a lot of discussion. But again, diversification does not mean decoupling. That's an important point I would like to stress. So if you read through the measures, you have 7 different areas. Maybe we can come back to them in the discussion. Lots of people in Germany have paid particular importance to security cooperation, because you can say that basically many of the things Germany has done already before. What's new? And people focus on security. Because that's one area where we have not been very exposed in the Indo-Pacific. We have been quite active actually in combating piracy in a lot of fora. And if we take the whole area approach, you can see also that the EU is running a very large and successful operation in front of the Horn of Africa, which is an important part of the Indo-Pacific as well. If you look at the security of shipping lanes, it's been one of the foreign policy successes of EU joint action in the field of security. I'm sorry to say that ahead of you, but partners have expectations. So one thing, as I said, we're stressing the importance of rules-based systems. So you will see that there's a lot of it written about the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But it's not only that. We know that this is a very contentious, but it's a very important issue. But it also relates to other issues. When you look at arms control, when you look at non-proliferation, when you see what's happening in the region as a whole, when you see of cooperation and also empowerment, security is not just hard security, but there's a lot around it. To us, and if you look at the concrete regulations, it means first also being here, being much more present in the region. Now, to many people it doesn't mean a thing. Why do you want to have an observer status in this and this organization? But it means that you first listen to the concerns of your partners on a regional area, and then you also direct what you're doing. And a very important point to me is a holistic view of security. If I look at other structures, they look at hard and fast security as imagined lines somewhere, and these lines have to be defined, defended, and fought for from the views of some, although we have clear international rules and guidelines on that. But to us, if you look at the paper, you will find a lot about climate change. Now, we, in our UN Security Council presence, we said that climate change is a security issue. And if you look at what could happen if weather patterns are changing, we believe that this strongly affects the security of countries. I mean, just look at Thailand with a drought, with changing rainfall patterns, flooding, all the issues about sharing the water resources in the Mekong area. There are a lot of immediate questions that come to mind, and coastal areas. So that's why you see there's a lot of it discussed in the area and about it. Germany is very present in the region. This is a commitment for ourselves to be more present. We have 38 diplomatic missions here, 31 branches of the Goethe Institute, 25 German chambers of commerce, delegations, representatives. So wherever you will look at it, you will find Germany quite soon in the region. And we want to structure this, and we want to say we want to stay, and we want to be stronger committed, because this region is of utmost importance. Now, the guidelines to us have been formulated in Germany with stakeholders, but what we're doing now is to reach out and say, this is what we are thinking, but for us, the answers and the responses from the region and from the partners are very important. It's not like a fixed document, a mantra, and this is where we go. I mean, you will find a lot of detailed things, but for us, discussions like this, and also internal discussions and engaging, is very important, because it gives us an idea, how do our partners view that? And how do they react to that? So I'm very happy that I'm here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Schmidt. Let me just pose a very quick follow-up question for you. So what, the guidelines, policy guidelines for the Indo-Pacific region. So to us around here, we would call this a way of hedging. So hedging is kind of the parlance of the East Asia, Southeast Asia kind of language. So not bandwagoning, not joining someone, and not just balancing, but diversifying, not decoupling. But where would you draw the line? Let's say South China Sea. You mentioned the rules-based liberal international order. I think this is welcomed by a lot of countries outside China and US. And I also think that when you say not having to choose, this is really the ASEAN position. So we'll come to ASEAN in a minute. But then, when it comes to, let's say, freedom of navigation, South China Sea, artificial islands, China's claims and belligerence, where does that fit into the rules-based outlook in the guidelines?
It fits into it by first actually making it a topic and speaking out. And even then, for many, it's uncomfortable to speak about it and to say, look, we have the international law of the sea, we have a decision, and how do we deal with the situation? Because if you don't even address the question, it's not there. It does not mean that we say, oh, here is a line. This is not the issue at all, but to actually bring it on the table and to support everybody who says, look, we need to discuss about it. I mean, ASEAN, it's a very delicate matter. ASEAN discusses about it, others, and to say, look, we have guidelines and we support the ones, and we give also that support, for instance, to ASEAN in negotiating and talking with China about this.
To our EU ambassador, Ambassador Tapiola. So please, and of course EU is not one country, but a entity of 27 plus, maybe 27, I don't know if you say 27.2 or 7.3 or 27.5 at this time with Brexit and all of that. Is EU then behind the curve a little bit? I mean, what would happen? You have major EU members now charting their own course, engaging with the Indo-Pacific in their own frames, on their own path. Where does that leave the European Union as a whole?
Thank you. Thank you, Ajahn Titinan, and thank you, Georg, for your comments. And I'd start by saying that, quite the contrary, we very much welcome the German contribution, just as we have welcomed the French contribution earlier. Indeed, if you read the German guidelines, you'll notice that it's a very European paper, and it brings a lot of European values on the table. And that, I think, is one of the big contributions which come with it. And that's basically the point of departure, which I'd like to take and a little bit maybe explain why in our more incremental approach to developing a policy on the so-called Indo-Pacific, we are in fact listening first to our stakeholders and then going forward. I think that you, in fact, Jay Ajahn-Titinan, you hit the nail with a quote from September last year, where you say that if the Asia-Pacific order has been defined by peace and prosperity, the rise of the Indo-Pacific is bringing a greater focus on regional security and tensions. And I think that this very much brings onto the surface the dilemma which we have had as the Union and which in a way we continue to have. The quote has aged well, I have to say, and COVID-19 has been acting, I would say, as an accelerator for pre-existing trends. In the wake of the pandemic, old reflexes away from multilateralism and towards nationalism and protectionism are returning. This is a cause for concern for all of us. We also see continued heightening of US-China tensions, and as you noted yourself, if there is a change of administration after the November 3rd elections in the US, rhetoric may change, but there are underlying issues which will take a lot longer to deal with. Now, these trends which I mentioned, against multilateralism, towards nationalism and protectionism, these trends go against everything we as the Union stand for. We stand for multilateralism, we stand for a rules-based international order, the strength of the rule of law rather than the law of the strong, dialogue, and peaceful conflict resolution. And this is where I would like to praise the German paper, because while we have been terminologically, and I'll get into that in a moment, a little bit more cautious with using the term Indo-Pacific, what the German contribution brings are the basic principles why we have been concerned over this switch of terminology. You are in fact marrying those principles and the concept, and I think that that's very, very important. Now, terminology has mattered to us. The political connotation of the Indo-Pacific concept has been about geopolitical competition rather than building, originally, rather than building a commonality, and our approach to the region has aimed to convey neutrality, and hence we have for a long time continued to refer to the Asia-Pacific. Now our connectivity strategy, for instance, combines political stability and a sustainable economic approach and adherence to market rules, EU and international requirements and standards. When the strategy came out, many were trying to find a competition between the strategy and the Belt and Road Initiative, but rather our narrative was very clear from the beginning. This is complementary. This is something which is not supposed to go into a competition, but into a constructive relationship. We've also been more land-focused than sea-based, but we are a maritime security provider, as you mentioned very well, and we are heavily committed to improving ocean governance. So this does bring towards, or this builds towards, our future approach and the building blocks of our future approach. Nonetheless, we are moving very much in the same direction as like-minded partners. Now, let me move a little bit to what you could say the big panda in the room, and that is our relationship with China. The Indo-Pacific concept has been seen by many from the outset as a containment strategy against China. And I have to say, honestly, we are reluctant to be part of a containment strategy. That's not in our DNA. For us, China is still an important economic partner, even growing, exceedingly so, an essential player in addressing global challenges. Climate change is one. But what is important to note that our position, which is very nuanced and more nuanced than that of some other actors, has started to have other features in it as well. We are having our own approach, which is one of strategic autonomy, and we are seeing clearer and clearer that in addition to the positive cooperative side, we do see China also as a systemic rival. And I think COVID-19 and the different coping strategies of COVID-19 have in fact underlined that rivalry, to which extent you, for instance, look at individual freedoms, to which extent you look at other issues such as this. Now, China is a rising world power, an economic giant, an assertive security actor, and is increasingly aggressive in its diplomacy. Many countries in Asia see China's response to COVID as very competent, and this is what I mentioned also on the systemic rivalry viewpoint. They are also in awe of Chinese economy, and COVID-19, for instance, has proven to be, in fact, a win for China. Whatever one may have said, that where you've had the first cases. There's also been criticism also inside Asia on showing the limits of Chinese soft power. That has to be admitted. Now, I do see that there's a different picture in many Western and most developed Asian countries, and Pew Research, for instance, shows views on China have become more critical in industrialized countries. Now, we are still working towards cooperative strategies. The EU and China are working towards an updated 2025 cooperation agenda, covering many areas, working together, which would be beneficial on both sides. The EU and China are still willing to engage, especially on trade and investment issues, although in many things we have to say our patience is also a little bit thin. So we have earlier been a bit wary on calling out China's actions too publicly. However, the harsh tonality of Chinese diplomacy, coupled with recent developments on the ground, notably in Hong Kong, have made it more difficult not to react. You saw in the EU-China leaders meeting earlier in September an increased voicing of our concerns as well, even if there was a lot of cooperative points. So you have these two aspects there. Now, I will not go very much further into the different contributions which we've seen from France and Germany on the Indo-Pacific, but will chart a little bit the way forward. I think it's quite clear, and I said that while we have been a little bit wary on the concept as such, we clearly do see this area, the area which is called the Indo-Pacific, as the growth center of the 21st century, and an area where we do want to cooperate. And I do very much take my dear German colleague's point of division lines, and I'm sitting between two very good colleagues and friends, the Indian ambassador and the German ambassador. And certainly when we have been wary of the concept, we have not been thinking of an East Asia, South Asia division line, quite the contrary. What I think we have been worried about is a division line which becomes a containment line rather than an area of cooperation. And, but what you will see in the months and year to come, that we will be, let's say, crystallizing our own thinking on the Indo-Pacific. Now, I will not give you timelines. I know that discussions are taking place, that they are going forward in Brussels, and it does need to be, as Georg said, as my German colleague said, a reflection which really takes on board all 27 member states. Boosting the EU's strategic autonomy can only benefit from such a review. And for instance, in the case of, and you will see also in our trade policy review, the concept of strategic autonomy, especially in terms of building a digital society, is becoming more and more a key point for the European Union. The Indo-Pacific is largely a maritime region connecting the US, Northeast Asia, the South China Sea, and the Indonesian Ocean, up to the eastern shore of Africa. And this is a very important area for where we have not necessarily always had one unified strategy, but rather many. And you mentioned the Africa strategy, where, for instance, what's happening in front of the Horn of Africa very much sort of goes under that. So we do need to, ASEAN always talks about connectivities. We need to connect our strategies into a whole in doing this. Now, we have taken some internal analysis of the relevance of the Indo-Pacific for us. And I have to say, we've had very, very good discussions between EU policy planners who recently met Indian and Australian policy planners with the issue of the Indo-Pacific on the agenda. So we are talking to each other, and I think that that's very, very important. Now, in conclusion, let me note, rather than answer questions, to put on the table some of the questions which we will need to reflect very carefully on the way forward towards having a more sort of joined-up EU-level policy strategy, if you so wish, on the Indo-Pacific. Now, we are looking at, first and foremost, in which areas would an Indo-Pacific perspective offer added value for the European Union, also with respect to sub-regions such as South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific. So I talked about the connecting of the different strategies, connecting of the different approaches. We don't want to create something for the sake of creating something for a terminology, but really to see what the value added is. And I'm sure there is a lot of it. Which initiatives could accompany an Indo-Pacific outlook? And what concrete action could the Union and its member states undertake? And thirdly, and this is one thing which is very certain, the Indo-Pacific concept has become a structuring element in global and regional relations. It is here to stay. And we need to think that in light of our own objective of a strategically autonomous European Union, how do we want to position ourselves in relation to this very, very broad region? I think I'll stop here, but I hope I've given a picture of why I wouldn't say we're off the curve, but I would rather say that why we have been driving slowly, carefully, and avoiding traffic accidents until now, and staying on the curve, but maybe with a reduced speed, but a strategic outlook. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador Tapiola. I also add that today is his holiday, but he's looking very smart for us today, this morning, or even though he's on holiday. Thank you very much. You mentioned the word containment. You also mentioned the systemic arrival, and that's something to be noticed, I think. I mentioned earlier about maybe in the guidelines, there are different vocabularies, which I think important. So very loose to a bit more tighter. So the strategy is something that is more kind of concrete, tangible, maybe a little bit implicit of a certain intention. And then you have, in the ASEAN think tanks, we've had a lot of terms. Outlook, of course, ASEAN came up with an ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Germany has guidelines. We also had a word concept, it's Indo-Pacific concept. There's also Indo-Pacific framework. And some of my think tank colleagues in ASEAN, we call the Indo-Pacific thing, which means it's just a thing. Because if you put any vocabulary to it, it has certain connotation. So I just note that. And then, it's about China. I mean, in many ways. And I'll just ask this as a follow-up very quickly, Ambassador Tapiola. Is China dividing up the EU? ASEAN is not EU, and EU is not ASEAN. We're qualitatively different, but there's some resemblance, I think. And ASEAN is being divided by China. Is EU being divided by China?
Let me put it that way, that no, I wouldn't say so. I do recognize that there are different relations between China and some of our member states. That's clear. And I realize that when you have something which you could only define, and we were talking about what is the EU, what kind of an animal are we, and it's very difficult to define because we're not an international organization, we're not a federal state, we're a polity where we do need to find a common approach. So I would say that we will only be divided if we are incapable of finding a common approach internally. And if you look at the fact that last year we managed to come up with a strategic outlook on China, a paper which everybody did sign up to, which defines China as a cooperation partner in the multilateral international system, as a negotiating partner based on our own interests and their interests, as an economic competitor, and as a systemic rival. And I know the last point has been very sort of difficult for also the Chinese. And let me underline that I'm not saying that Beijing is wanting to shape societies, but of course there's different attractivenesses which are coming in, and the COVID-19 crisis has shown some of those attractivenesses. We do believe in a democratic, open society with the kind of institutions which we very much cherish, democratic institutions, and of course there's a bit of systemic rivalry there. But by and large, when you look at the fact that we are going through difficult internal discussions, but we are coming out of them in more or less the same place, with more or less the same concepts, I would not talk about a division, but the sort of typical difficulties which all of us have to face in policy formulation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll just add a little, I think, worthwhile tangent here. You know, in ASEAN now we have a controversy. Someone from Singapore has remarked that ASEAN can do better without Cambodia. You know, that's quite a statement. But I think it also reflects a lot of the behind the scenes and also the frustrations among ASEAN member states themselves vis-a-vis China and the broader region. I'll come now to Ambassador Suchitra Durai. First of all, thank you very much, Ambassador Suchitra, for being with us. And my apologies. In the process of making the flyer, we're not graphic artists, so we have to kind of copy and paste. And I think our map does not fully reflect India's weight and size. So I'll have Ambassador Suchitra will elaborate on that. I'll just maybe preface it this way. You know, when we had the Asia-Pacific, which was 3 decades, we had the Asia-Pacific to talk about. And now it's all about Indo-Pacific. The Asia-Pacific, if you look at APEC, APEC has a hyphen. But if you look at hyphen, I've said before and written in academic papers, that the hyphen is New Zealand, right? But the Indo-Pacific has a hyphen. There's no Indo-Pacific without a hyphen. There's some Asia-Pacific terminology without a hyphen. Indo-Pacific shifts the center of gravity of the 21st century towards India. I mean, Indo-Pacific, the Indo part is really India, Indian Ocean. And of course, once you move it this way, the center of gravity to me now would be maybe Indonesia, but Thailand, Myanmar certainly is central. I mean, these are the peninsula borders both Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So technically, Thailand would border both sides. The Andaman Sea would be Indian Ocean, Gulf of Thailand, the Pacific Ocean. So we're in a good geographical spot here again. But for India, of course, China is writ large. Asia-Pacific, Indian Ocean, again, we're looking at China. So from the India view, Ambassador Suchitra, and the guidelines mentioned India, I think 57 times. I have to go back and check. But a lot of India is second after ASEAN. How does India see the Indo-Pacific? I noticed that India is not as keen on the FOIP as on the IP itself. FOIP being the US-led, Quad-based, free and open Indo-Pacific. But India talks more about Indo-Pacific.
Firstly, good morning to everyone, and thank you, Achan, for gathering all of us. Very interesting discussion so far, Excellencies. I think very rightly, I think the Ambassador of Germany mentioned the fact that this has been actually a seamless space historically. It's been fragmented perhaps in the last, say, 200, 250 years or so. I'll tell you why it is seamless, because Indians and the Arabs sailed all over what we call the Indo-Pacific since centuries, and that is why we found them going all the way up to the eastern seaboard of China. And you had people from Southeast Asia in Africa. So it has been, in fact, historically a seamless maritime space. Although the term Indo-Pacific itself is a recent geopolitical construct, as you rightly said, for people in India, we recognized the term and we came across the term firstly when I think Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, in his first term, came to India in August 2007, and when he spoke at our parliament, where he spoke about the confluence of the two seas. And that is when this awareness and this recognition came to Indian strategic thinkers about looking at it as a joint space, strategic space. Our own movement towards outlining our vision of the Indo-Pacific has been organic. For those of you who have not been following it, we have been doing this constantly for the last 3 decades, where it has moved from our Look East policy, actually in 1992, which became our Act East policy in 2014. The fact that we became a part of we were a founder member of the Indian Ocean Rim Association since 1997. And in the Foreign Ministry itself, this recognition was there in the way we created our newer divisions. In 2014, we created a new Indian Ocean Region division. It's interesting because India has always, I think, had a predominance of looking at everything from a continental point of view. While, of course, the maritime aspects were always there, but not given the kind of emphasis that they have been given in recent times. But this has shifted completely, and now the orientation is very clearly also geared towards the maritime space which surrounds us. So our vision of the Indo-Pacific has been evolutionary. Outlining it in so many words, of course, came when the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, spoke at the Shangri-La Dialogue in June 2018, where he made it very clear that our vision is a positive one, and it is not directed against any one country. So we do stress the fact that it should be free, but also that it should be open and inclusive, and which embraces all in a common pursuit of progress and prosperity. Which is why in our definition of the geography, not only have we included all the nations which are part of this geography, that is from the shores of Africa to the Americas, but also others beyond who have a stake in it. Naturally, Southeast Asia is at its core for us. Therefore, ASEAN's centrality has been mentioned and pronounced by our leaders at every occasion. So what you say about Southeast Asia, Thailand being really at the geographical heart of the Indo-Pacific, really connecting the two oceans, is very much recognized by us in India. We have also spoken, like others, of a rules-based order. We have talked about the importance of having a respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the fact that all nations, irrespective of their size, have to be treated equally. and of course the need to uphold international commitments. And this is also the foundation for India's faith in multilateralism and regionalism. We have spoken about freedom of navigation, not just the freedom of navigation over sea, but also freedom of overflight. We have spoken about unimpeded commerce and the peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law. We have spoken about an open and stable international trade regime. And as far as connectivity is concerned, we have made it very clear that this is not just about physical infrastructure, it's also about building bridges of trust. So connectivity initiatives must be based on respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, on consultation, good governance, transparency, viability, and sustainability. It must empower nations and not place them under an impossible debt burden. So, and we look upon an Asia of cooperation, not competition. And which is why, in his Shangri-La speech, Prime Minister Modi also emphasized that we should not allow contests to turn into conflicts and differences into disputes. And while we, like others, will be working in groups of 3 or 4 in the plurilateral approach or in a bilateral approach on issues on which we share a commonality, they will not be alliances of containment. So I wanted to be very clear to you and to everybody else that ours is not an approach which believes in containment. But we will work together with different groups of countries to protect our planet on non-proliferation, against terrorism and cyber threats. It has also resulted in a number of very practical initiatives for us, including the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which was outlined by Prime Minister Modi during his visit to Bangkok last year during the East Asia Summit itself, where we have outlined several initiatives, particularly in the area of the maritime domain, including against marine litter, in favor of the blue economy, and so on and so forth. Prior to outlining of our Indo-Pacific strategy, we actually focused on the Indian Ocean because that is really our immediate priority for us. And in March 2015, during a visit to Mauritius, Prime Minister Modi actually outlined our Indian Ocean policy, which was centered around 4 areas basically on security, because we have to do everything that we have to safeguard our mainland as well as our islands. We have about 1,200 islands, both in the Arabian Sea as well as in the Bay of Bengal, and they all have to be secured for us. There was an emphasis on economic and security cooperation so that we can build on the maritime security capabilities of not just of India, but also our friends and our neighbors in the region. We believed in collective action and cooperation to advance peace and security and to respond to emergencies. So therefore, HADR is a very important aspect of our Indian Ocean and our Indo-Pacific policy. And of course, sustainable development of all. And he mentioned at that time also that our goal was to foster a climate of trust and transparency, and to ensure that there would be a peaceful resolution of maritime issues and an increase in maritime cooperation. So if you look at both these policies which have been outlined, basically it is like you can look at it in terms of concentric circles as far as our Indo-Pacific policy is concerned. The core itself is the maritime infrastructure for the mainland India, the development of our island assets, and connectivity to our immediate neighbors, which is outlined in our neighborhood first policy. The next circle includes the maritime space beyond India's borders, and includes its island neighbors such as Sri Lanka, Maldives, Mauritius, and Seychelles. And on land, it means connectivity to the extended neighborhood, which is where the India, Myanmar, Thailand trilateral highway comes in. Also the Kaladan multimodal transport between India and Myanmar. And the next circle, of course, outer circle, is the revival of the Indian Ocean community, which is what you mentioned also, which has been basically a seamless and a cooperative place for us. And the outermost circle would be will take India to the Pacific in terms of policy exchanges, in terms of capability exercises, and cooperative mechanisms. So in other words, in terms of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, we have been a founding member since 1997. We find it a very useful mechanism. And in 2011, India gave a lot of content to IORA by actually outlining 6 very important areas. We have been in the naval area, having started this Indian Ocean Naval Symposium since 2008, where we have navies of, I think, about 34, 35 navies, which come together and discuss every 2 years. There are also other areas which are, I would say, are building blocks, including the Mekong-Ganga cooperation, which completes 20 years this year, where we've been working with the Mekong countries. We are now a development partner for ACBIX, and we are, of course, founding member of BIMSTEC, which is very important for the Bay of Bengal region. Coming to, of course, Germany's policy, I would not, of course, it's not my mandate to respond officially, because that will be done in Delhi or in Berlin. And even as I speak, I think there's going to be an official visit very soon, which is going to happen to your country as well as other countries in Europe. So I'm sure the official stance will be, outlined there. But I can speak freely about the areas of convergence that I see between your policy and ours. The emphasis on multilateralism, which you maintained very rightly, the emphasis on climate change, the fact that you look upon the need for diversification of value chains, on security cooperation, on counterterrorism. These are all areas that we share as common concerns. The German guidelines speak about joining the International Solar Alliance, so welcome. Thank you very much. Also the CDRI, the Coalition for the Development of Disaster-Resistant Infrastructure. S&T cooperation, we already do that bilaterally with Germany on a very big level. There is a very important center, as you rightly mentioned, on science and technology cooperation and on innovation. And Germany has also been a dialogue partner in IORA since 2015. I believe you're also going to join RECAP, the regional agreement against piracy and armed robbery. And there's going to be, I think, presence of your country in the International Fusion Center. We ourselves have been in the forefront of sharing of white shipping data. We entered into agreements, bilateral agreements, with over 22 countries since 2015. We ourselves have a fusion center in Gurgaon, very close to Delhi. So we believe that these are all very important for enhancing maritime security and understanding the maritime, for enhancing maritime domain awareness. So I think with that, I will stop now. I can only add that for us, the Indo-Pacific is also a very natural way of doing business with the countries of both these very important spaces. And the underlying view for us is that India's worldview is democratic, it's consultative, and it is equitable. So therefore, the Indo-Pacific is a very natural way of looking at the world for us, this part of the world, for a Pacific Indian. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Suchitra Durai. I'll just mention first, the Indo-Pacific is inherently maritime. Inherently maritime. So in geopolitics, we have one of our key themes would be, this land-based powers and the sea-based countries, sea-based maritime powers. So Indo-Pacific is inherently, I think, intrinsically maritime and sea-based. And so I notice a lot of countries now building up navies. India included, China, of course. Even Thailand wants to get submarines, even though, I don't know we'll go very far with that one. Ambassador Durai, you didn't mention the Quad at all. India is a Quad member. And what you did mention that I noticed, I like it, by the way, the Indian kind of grounding up. And you mentioned the word organic, and I agree. India always has its own way. It's like the India's way. Not my way, but India's way. It's organic, it has its own outlook, it has its own groundings. And what you've described, this goes back to the Indian kind of a non-alignment preference, non-aligned movement. Could this kind of, you didn't mention the Quad, but you did mention a lot of schemes that India projects. Could this kind of non-USA, non-PRC, evolve into kind of the third way, non-aligned 21st century cooperation, Ambassador Durai?
Thank you, Achan. The Quad, of course, is not a recent, exercise. It has been happening. Our discussions have been happening bilaterally in a plurilateral manner, with different groups of countries. As you know, India is part of the BRICS grouping. India is part of G20. India, Japan, Germany, and Brazil, which is not here, of course, are part of the G4. So where Quad is concerned, it is a group of 4 countries which have several convergences. Primarily, we are, of course, democracies, and we have a common approach to doing certain things. And it has been a very useful, platform for sharing our viewpoints. But India has always valued its strategic autonomy. You could call it non-alignment. You could call it something else. So therefore, which is why we have emphasized in the outlining of our vision of the Indo-Pacific that we will be working on issues which are of common interest with different groups of countries. For us, this is not a containment strategy. It's not directed against any one country. And we believe that our policy of strategic autonomy, which we have adopted since we became independent in 1947, continues to be very important and an underlying principle of our foreign policy, and will continue to be, so.
Thank you very much. Yes, everyone who's anyone, not only are they coming and returning to the Indo-Pacific, but they all want to have strategic autonomy. And this goes for ASEAN as well. So I just mentioned first we'll come to the Q&A kind of questions and comments period soon. So we have this on live stream, so there'll be some audiences and participants and viewers online. So please feel free to write in your questions and comments, and then we'll field some from here as well. Ajahn Kasirat, please, we had the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific 2019. Thailand was the chair of that. That was probably the most salient accomplishment of the Thai chairmanship of ASEAN last year. And then it was more like the, ASEAN Outlook on the FOIP, not just the IP. it was a reaction. ASEAN had to come up with some kind of reaction and answer to the very aggressive peddling by the US of the FOIP. Now, I'll invite you now to talk about ASEAN a little bit. The one thing that you cannot talk about, okay? Please don't talk about. So after this, my students have to write an essay on how ASEAN should treat and view the German guidelines on Indo-Pacific. So don't answer that one. Don't say how ASEAN should treat and view, the EU and German guidelines and Indo-Pacific outlook and preference. But talk about ASEAN in every other way, please.
Okay, I will not help my students, our students. So thank you very much, and thank you, ISIS Thailand, for having me here, and I'm very honored to be able to join this distinguished panel. So I'm going to focus a bit on the policy guidelines on the Indo-Pacific issued by Germany, titled Germany, EU, Asia, Shaping the 21st Century Together. So we have around 80 years to go, but since it's broad enough, I think it could kind of embrace all our shared viewpoints really nicely, and maybe its implications for ASEAN a bit, but I'll decide how ASEAN should react to it. There have been no official positions yet, so I'm sure, it's, I think I'm allowed to say that at the least it will be welcomed by ASEAN since it's shared the viewpoint of the AOIP already, and it went beyond the geographical fault lines. And the fact that I think the concept after the US version has issued the Indo-Pacific has become much politicized. So it's quite nice to see other versions as well, and the fact that maybe the EU tried to have an equidistance instead between the superpowers. And I agree with Ambassador Schmidt that it's actually directed towards domestic audience as well. It's to also communicate to German relations ministers, other civil servants, also the EU, how Germany could support the EU presence in the region, Indo-Pacific. So a number of incidents have actually complicated China-EU relations recently. So this is issued amidst COVID, that is still raging. There's still SCS, the South China Sea issue, that Germany together with France and the UK have made joint statements showing their concerns last year and recently this year. And we have seen some countries in Europe, the UK included, phasing out Huawei in 5G network. But actually Huawei was allowed license in Germany. So this is an interesting point to examine, and also we might see some reorientations of the policy towards China a bit. So from ASEAN side, the policy guidelines already identified ASEAN as key partners. I mean, regardless of how many times it's mentioned, I think it's clear that ASEAN was quite valued by German, EU, Europe, this policy guideline, right? So as I mentioned, it shares some of the viewpoint with the AOIP already. So I'll address some key main takeaways from this that are constitutive of mutual benefits. So first, the emphasis on rule-based order and international cooperation, I think it's very much needed. I mean, ASEAN wanted to become a rules-based organization itself, so it marries really nicely. This is the emphasis on, that we should not always be based on the law of the strong, we exist in a multipolar world where it's been difficult more for the law of the strong to apply in every cases. So no country should, and I quote, as in the time of the Cold War, be forced to choose between two sides or fall into a state of unilateral dependency. So this diversifying of partnerships are really, I think, welcomed by ASEAN. And Germany has the potential to tap into the existing regional architecture and strengthen the regional cooperation a bit by showing, of course, its willingness, its commitment to increase the engagement with ASEAN countries as a whole, and in effect, strengthening ASEAN for instance, in a number of main venues, namely ASEAN-centric security architecture, meaning the ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum, where the EU is already present since this is ASEAN dialogue partner. We have seen Germany as a largest bilateral donor to ASEAN within the EU already, and so it wants to support the EU as well in other strategic partnerships with ASEAN and upgrade its own engagement to dialogue partner. So formally, Germany was our development partner, and I think the dialogue partners could be negotiated in the future. Next that we see the potential here is the ACMEX, as Ambassador Devray has already mentioned, the Ayeyarwady Chao Phraya Mekong Economic Cooperation Strategy that was, Thailand's kind of like pet project, but it was inert for a while and it's really lacked resources. So we see that as a way in to strengthen this kind of sub-regional cooperation as well. And the GMS, the LMC, and the venues are quite numerous. The point here is that China was present in the GMS, like Greater Mekong, and the LMC, the Lanka Mekong Commission, but not the ACMEX. So the ACMEX might provide some kind of venue that, like China was not a key player there, but you can actually have closer cooperations with the CLMV and also Thailand. And also Germany signifies its interest to have more engagement through becoming an observer at the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, the ADMM Plus. So that's really increasing commitment from Germany's side. So the interest and intention to intensify Germany's engagement on the rules-based order, I think also have implications on peaceful conflict transformation. It could, as in the case of SES, because of course Germany has interest in open routes, freedom of navigation and such. And it's very interesting that it's said quite clearly that it intends to support the COC, the legally binding COC. So that's an upgrade from the DOC between China and ASEAN member states for the South China Sea through other tangible projects on international maritime law and provide a greater resources for stabilization and mediation in the Indo-Pacific region. So this has to be viewed, as I earlier mentioned, in light of the joint statement by France, Germany, and UK on the situation in the South China Sea today meaning August last year, but it's called like this, where the arbitration award was cited. So the arbitration award was actually kind of avoided to be mentioned a bit by the ASEAN official stance because it didn't want to divide ASEAN members to have different interests towards China. But recently the trio, France, Germany, the UK, again submit a joint note verbal to the UN, actually around 3 weeks after we have this policy guideline. So they really intend to back this commitment towards the resources of peaceful conflict transformation. So this note verbal highlighted, among others, also the claims that Beijing's exercise of historic rights do not actually comply with the UN clause. So really, Germany exhibits some kind of really norm-conforming, consistent behavior that ASEAN, if it wants to become a rules-based organization, really need that. Yes, so this kind of normative resources for further peaceful resolution is much, I think, very well run by ASEAN. Secondly, the green wave, all the rage now. I mean, ASEAN has intensified its environmental cooperation in recent years. It's very clear from the policy guidelines that Germany is very much interested in the environment, climate change, and Germany intended to expand the development cooperation in environmental areas as well. So there is a case now for ASEAN to embrace green growth, actually pushed by Singapore a couple of years ago, and that will entail I think a reform of the infrastructure as well of some of the industries. So these are all the trends, right? Climate resilient economies for ASEAN, low carbon economy now. China, of course, is a key player. I mean, Southeast Asia might still have like, comparatively less carbon emissions, but last year, like for example, in China side, President Xi pledged that China would become carbon neutral by 2060. I think that marries well into like EU's intention as well to have this European Green Deal focus of this Commission's mandate, I think, and the EU decided to become also aim for climate neutrality in 2050. So EU tackling climate change here, they emphasize on a global net approach in multilateral framework. And so China is really significant while we see that the US distance itself from this multilateral network in environment. So in Paris Agreement, for example, I think EU can look for to China as a kind of like shared common goals. And Germany and China already lead in renewable technology, renewable energy. So I think this is where the EU really wants to work more closely with China. And ASEAN could really benefit from the cooperation, the know-how, the green technology transfer. The future is climate diplomacy now, other than, well, yeah, realpolitik, of course. Thirdly, on connectivity, especially digital connectivity. So we have seen this keyword in the policy guidelines as well. Germany wants to accelerate the implementation of the EU-Asia connectivity strategy as well. So we have seen, for example, we've seen the Qatar, the EU-ASEAN Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement that is still ongoing. If it's accomplished, it will be a kind of first block-to-block air transport agreement and have like vast implications, not only on transport, but also like other economies, cultural exchange, and such. And again, complements well with the master plan on ASEAN Connectivity 2025. It's like, it's quite natural, seamless cooperation, the impact 2025. So I think the federal government and the EU are together seeking to try to enhance connectivity between this region and Europe and closer cooperation in the sphere of digital transformation. So again, all appropriate infrastructure has to be there. So like very, many numerous areas of cooperation, transport, energy, digital technology. And Germany has a keen interest in sustainable connectivity as well. So it's not just like railroads, railway networks, or roads built. It's how you can integrate the sustainability into this kind of infrastructure, the connectivity, the improved transport networks could be seen as critical to the BRIs in China as well, even though BRIs have been like kind of evolved a bit to be a kind of 2.0 version and become like more greener, more sustainable, but especially on some kind of these big projects BRI, which could, there were some concerns that it would create debts for some of the poorer countries in ASEAN. So this, again, sustainable connectivity initiatives very much welcome. Two concerns arise from this third point, though, with this operation. I mean, firstly, we have seen the decoupling of technology between the US and China. And EU might want to, there's this space here, and I think EU will want to become more resilient amidst this kind of decoupling as phasing out Huawei was actually, it can be replaced by European companies such as Ericsson and Nokia. But it might not, it has to have some of the careful planning, like long-term planning in the future, but resilience, technological, especially this resilience might be more difficult for ASEAN. That still depend a lot on, the technology and all the hardware parts as well. Secondly, the digital sovereignty. We have strong concerns over the economic, social influence of non-EU technology companies. I mean, can we argue that it's, well, there's not like much hard evidence yet, but this trust is there already of the backdoor like software, for example, that this could threaten not only EU citizens' control though, but like all over the planet, in ASEAN as well, the control over their personal data, and constrains the growth of EU high-tech companies maybe, and the ability of national and EU rule makers to enforce their laws. So ASEAN is not an exception. ASEAN is also very vulnerable in terms of the digital sovereignty. So all in all, I think that this is Germany's attempt to strengthen EU-ASEAN cooperation at a region-to-region level as well. So from having China, even though EU kind of agreed that in some ways, China was identified as rival competitor with different values. I mean, they have different values from EU. But EU also intends to cooperate with China in many levels and many areas of cooperation as well. ASEAN is not very big on values though, so there's a gap there. ASEAN has no kind of, well, it's changing, but so far, that's not a big thing in ASEAN. Like, we have actually no kind of clear value-driven, normative-based foreign policies, such as in the EU, our friend. In ASEAN, you might see some of the talks there, and we repeat ourselves, of course, we care about human rights and such, right? But it's not very concrete. I think it might change a bit, of course, with positive encouragements, positive reinforcements by our dialogue partners here. For example, the IUU case, it can be seen as a kind of normative, change as well, maybe motivated by interest, of course. But we have seen a kind of region-wide change while ASEAN adopts some of the guidelines that prevent the IUU products from entering supply chains. And that got supported by Thailand, who has changed some of its domestic law to correspond with the IUU policy. You can argue to avoid the yellow card, which can turn into a red card. But in the end, that change kind of proved to be a bit more sustainable because the law is there, and that's tap into the motivation to become a more rules-based operation in the future as well. So all in all, this is which ASEAN really shared and really benefit from, is to prevent selective multilateralism by the great powers, meaning that they'll only go multilateral in some issues that benefit them, especially lower politics issues. We need this kind of generalized reciprocity in state where everyone is under the same rules, everyone benefit more or less at the same level. So this inclusive policy, I think it's very much welcome. I think it's quite happy because exclusion, it's not, even though it's mentioned, it's not ASEAN's official stance anyway. And so these policy guidelines, I think, complements well with what ASEAN stands for and what it intends to become as a community, rules-based, caring and sharing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kavachan Kasirat. I like the last point about the kind of inclusive and open multilateralism as opposed to a selective multilateralism. A couple of points I would like to highlight. You mentioned ACMEX, and Ambassador Suchitra also mentioned ACMEX. ACMEX, in EU, you talk about ASEAN a lot, but I think that, coming into focus as a region on its own right, in its own terms, is the Mekong region, as distinct from the broader ASEAN. Of course, ASEAN is a region of almost 700 million population, fairly young, $3 trillion GDP, but it has two components to it, divided by the South China Sea, and that's the maritime component, and then there's the mainland Southeast Asia, the Mekong mainland. The Mekong mainland is a region of, not a sub-region anymore, I don't think. I think I would call it a region in its own right, with 250 million population, approaching $1 trillion GDP, and growing and expanding. Thailand, the slowest. So the Mekong, ACMEX, is kind of a hedging for ASEAN. And Mekong now is an ASEAN agenda item. Before, South China Sea is ASEAN, but now Mekong, I think under Vietnam's chairmanship, has become an ASEAN issue. You know, South China Sea, all ASEAN members have to be concerned about South China Sea, but in the past, the Mekong was for the Mekong countries. The Mekong was for CLMT, but now I think the Mekong is for the broader ASEAN. So that's and China also, of course, has the Lanchang Mekong Cooperation, LMC, which I think the Mekong countries, the lower Mekong countries are not happy about. So that's why ACMEX is back in vogue. And that's why ACMEX is being kind of revived. This is from 2003 under the Thaksin administration. So I thought I would highlight that as a kind of a distinct region for our EU friends, Mekong, not just subsumed under ASEAN, Mekong mainland. And Ajahn Kasira also gave some very good concrete recommendations about moving forward with EU. I think the digital sovereignty, you know, the whole kind of the decoupling, the US-China trade tech, the whole US-China conflict is going to have ramifications for all of us. And one area that the EU can kind of fill a gap would be, you know, on the technology side, could be a benefit to the EU to fill in that gap. And also we are concerned about digital sovereignty, and I think EU could have a role to play there. Finally, I'll just say about values. So ASEAN is not about values, more about norms maybe. That's what we're known for in ASEAN. But you know, on the values, you mentioned the IUU, the IUU. But there are other broader values that I think EU stands for, that ASEAN is grappling as a whole, grappling with. Basic rights, fundamental freedoms. I mean, you know, this is labor standards and so on. But if you project that broader, it's even more fundamental basic rights and freedoms. Finally, I'll just ask before we go to questions and comments from the floor and online to Ajahn Kasira. You know, so can you see the plausibility of ASEAN minus X being real life, which means that ASEAN without Cambodia, is that a possibility? I mean, it's unthinkable, but when ASEAN was 4, when ASEAN was 5, the original ASEAN. So if you think of ASEAN as Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and Singapore, you can get a lot more done. But now you think about ASEAN with Cambodia, and then with China, it gets less done.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the fact that it was even mentioned, and it's kind of like, okay, it's you know, because in a couple of years it might be more difficult to have this kind of mentioning even out there or in the interviews, like it's a kind of taboo in ASEAN. So it's interesting now that, well, some have been questioning the contributions or the future that ASEAN might be like EU. I mean, well, in like Dr. Surin's one of the interviews, he actually said that it would be unthinkable, like we're not like that, right? Very inclusive. I mean, ASEAN minus X is not a new thing because it's actually kind of allowed in some of the like trade initiatives, agreements in the past. It's okay to do that because we're big on sovereignty, so you can join our own time and all that. But if you mean that ASEAN minus X in the sense that there would be some expelled or, you know, that I think it still might be very difficult because ASEAN operate on, again, consultation and consensus. So to achieve the consensus and to have a member being excluded, that would be really, really difficult as far as I can see, though. So it might not be that easy to achieve. And yeah, but if they, again, if the issue is really serious and they can talk together and they come to the consensus, then maybe in the far future that might happen as well.
I would agree. I mean, I think it's so unthinkable, but I think it's a useful alarm going off, you know, that someone could contemplate from Singapore that, you know, maybe ASEAN could be a lot stronger without Cambodia. won't happen anytime soon, but the thinking could maybe lead to some rethinking. Let me open the floor now to questions, comments, are also online. Anyone, feel free, please. There's a microphone in the middle. Germany, EU, ASEAN, India, ASEAN, and Indo-Pacific. Please, Ambassador Nishida. Please tell us who you are first and then go ahead.
I'm Ambassador of Japan. Well, I'd like to thank you for giving the floor, and I'd like to join my fellow ambassadors. What's FOIP? As the professor mentioned, it was Abe Shinzo. It was August 2016. He mentioned firstly the concept of FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific. And since then, we have been making effort to split out, to share this concept to other countries, including the United States and also the European friends. And so now we are very, very grateful to share the common view with the European friends, as well as India, Australia, and other, New Zealand, Canada also. It is not the confrontational concept. So we don't never say to choose either BRI or FOIP. It is an open and inclusive concept. It's open to Chinese friends also. So what we are doing, making effort is, it's an establishment of the network in a multiple layer. That's so, the Quad is just one of them, just one of them. We have a trilateral, we have a bilateral, we have other forums. So, no matter the mixture of the countries, this kind of forum is very important. So, well, China described, the Quad as a petit NATO, but it is not. It is just one of the forum. And in the FOIP of Japanese version consists of the 3 pillars. First is the rule of law, well, the promoting and establishing the rule of law, freedom of navigation, freedom of aviation, and free trade. Second pillar is economic prosperity, particularly promoting the connectivity in these regions. Not only physical connectivity, but also human-to-human connectivity, that is human development, and also the institutional connectivity, that is a facilitation of the custom systems, such as. And the third pillar is bringing about the safety and security. What we are doing is like capacity building and to the maritime law enforcement structures to the ASEAN countries, and also the HADR corporation. But the problem is, only Japan, what can we do in this region? That's why we need a network. We discuss what we can do together. So it is a kind of complementary law among the partners to bring about those rule-based society, economic prosperity, and also security issues. That is what we are aiming for. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ambassador Nishida. I'll just add that Prime Minister Abe has been very influential. I think that we will miss, I can safely say broadly within the ASEAN think tanks and so on, that he has shown very strong and clear leadership, and the ASEAN member states have been receptive to it. So I think we will miss the Abe administration, Abe years. Question, comment, anyone else? Yes?
Okay. Good morning, Excellencies, my professor. I will try not to paraphrase.
Please tell us your name first.
Okay, my name is Krawi, and I'm a fourth-year student, international relations at Chulalongkorn University. I will try not to paraphrase your essay question here. So, okay, yeah. So I think that my question to the floor or Excellencies here is focusing on the chairmanship of ASEAN this year. of Vietnam under the theme of cohesive and responsive ASEAN. I think that considering Vietnam that they have a very specific standpoint on China, on South China Sea, they have a lot of more conflict on China. So what should we expect from Vietnam this year, on this year's chairmanship? Or the latest aspiration of Germany and EU can be the new choice for Vietnam to deliver something from this chairmanship of Vietnam or not? Because I think that this year, for me as a student, I don't hear that much news and or any statement from Vietnam chairmanship that much. So I think that I would like to hear from you here. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a good question. Vietnam is between is in mainland ASEAN, of course, but also in maritime ASEAN. It has most prickly relations with China, but yet China is the most important economic partner. I'll just add to this a little bit that this is a pandemic year. It's a very unusual year. So as a Vietnam chair, they had a lot of planning going into this year. They put a lot of resources. Not only is Vietnam chairing ASEAN, Vietnam is also a member, a non-permanent member of the Security Council, the UN Security Council. So 2020 was going to be was billed as Vietnam's big year on the international stage and the regional platform, but because of the pandemic. And I'll just add to this question, how will these different countries, including Germany, EU, the pandemic adversely affects everyone, all countries, but who affected more or less, and post-pandemic, who will have the advantage maybe, or maybe suffering least, and maybe therefore have a better position to carry on. I think that's a good point to address at this time. Do we have this very extraordinary, profound pandemic year? So for Vietnam chairmanship, Jan Kasirat, they want to even extend the chairmanship year a little bit because they feel like they didn't really have a good turn. And after Vietnam, by the way, for ASEAN, we have Brunei next. After Brunei is Cambodia. So we're looking at very different chairs in the medium term, and this has consequences for ASEAN. Maybe we'll go. Can we start with you, Ambassador Schmidt? I mean, Vietnam. The question is about Vietnam, China, Vietnam chairmanship, ASEAN. How you see that? But even broader, the pandemic year. How are we going to re-emerge? And do you think that China will re-emerge stronger than the US, for example? Or will the EU be weakened by the pandemic year?
Well, thank you. Let me first risk to get all your anger. Of course, for you, the students, if you just say in your essays you wholeheartedly support the German Indo-Pacific guidelines, you would get full marks from me. But and wrongly so, but I think rightly so from your professor. And actually, we're here to also hear your views and to say, like, look, you are wrong on this. You're not. You have overlooked it. So it would be full marks, but it wouldn't be very helpful. So I'm very much looking forward to what you make out of this and what you bring back to us. Because as I said again, it's a dialogue process. It's something that we discussed amongst ourselves, but we need the feedback from all people around and say, like, look, are we on the right track? Where should we adjust? And a good system is always, a smart system is always a learning system. So that to begin with. Of course, as a diplomat, it's not easy for me to comment on Vietnam's ASEAN chairmanship in an ASEAN member country. But of course, you can see with Vietnam and the EU as a whole that Vietnam has concluded a free trade agreement. So a lot has been, if I compare the different concepts, and if you look at the German policy guidelines, it speaks a lot of multilateralism. And multilateralism also includes multilateral trade regimes. And it's not my country first, or this first, or that first. A multilateral trade regime takes a long time to negotiate, and it's always a compromise between different sets of interests. That's why it's so complicated, but this is how the world, I think, runs in a better way than just saying, oh, it's my interest and either you take it or leave it. So Vietnam, we have undergone these discussions. and it makes a big difference. There are some commitments also by Vietnam, because free trade agreement involves also much more than just trade, but it involves like business and human rights. It involves like certain standards. The EU ambassador can talk much more and much more qualified about it. But this is the first thing that came to my mind. Now, for the Vietnamese, I think it is very difficult because of the pandemic and the travel restrictions. And one of the points of the guidelines, and it was said before, it's guidelines also for internally. If you want to be present in the region, it's very important for us to be here and to come here and to attend all these functions and to be visibly here. And this makes it very difficult now with the travel restrictions. If you know each other, you can have a video conference call. That's fine. It doesn't replace meeting, but it's okay. But to build up that personal level, it's so important, and I hope that we can come into a different way of dealing with it, into a different way of risk analysis, and allowing political contacts on a high level on others, taking all the precautions. Thailand has taken a first step. I mean, the Chinese foreign minister came here without quarantine, and I think it's a good symbol. I would like also our high-ranking politicians to come here. We take care that they're not endangering anybody, but we should find, I think, a new balance of allowing these personal contacts, because it is really important. And in the pandemic, that puts an enormous stress to all of our societies. I think globally, we need these contacts more than ever, not to politicize our responses, to make sure that we cooperate with vaccination, that we cooperate with diagnosis, because it doesn't help if you say, oh, yes, we made it, we beat COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 is managed, and the minute you open the borders, it comes from another country. I mean, this shows very much in a globally interconnected world, in a commercially interconnected world, it's one approach to say we do it on our own, but it comes with a heavy price tag. Thank you.
Please feel free to add, or you don't have to, Ambassador Tapiola.
Well, I will add a little bit. I mean, I was about to. Two comments on ASEAN and the EU, and then on the question you asked, which is basically China-EU and how well we manage, how well we're going forward. First of all, of course, for us, Vietnam has been a long-term champion of strategic partnership between the EU and ASEAN, and has been a long-term close cooperation partner. At the same time, we should remember that ASEAN's relations with dialogue partners goes very much through the country coordinators rather than the presidency country, in Singapore in this case. So that's there. Now, the German ambassador hinted already at this when you asked, is the EU going down, China going up, so on with COVID-19? I would say that you're seeing at this moment, unfortunately, a second wave of COVID-19 cases in the EU. But partially this is let's say, it's a consequence of a fact that we have had to do a very careful balancing act between economy and health. And we have had to open up. Now we are closing certain places down as well, and so on. We do realize that there are two elements. There's the health and there's the sustainability of the economy. You've also seen a very strong package of 750 billion, which we are putting in place to support our economies. These are difficult times, and things come at a cost. And that, I think, China has been very, China has been very lucky in that they managed to contain the virus and get their economy going, but with relatively, let's say, draconian steps which would not be possible in Europe in the same way. And I think that this is also going to be a decision which Thailand will have to take. Where is the balancing point there? Thanks.
I think coming to Vietnam itself, I cannot really comment on the specific issue of their chairmanship of ASEAN. But what I can say is that bilaterally we've had always historically a very, very fruitful relationship with Vietnam, which is also a strategic partnership. And I think we have been working very closely with Vietnam during their chairmanship of ASEAN. It has been a difficult year, as you have yourself pointed out. I think it cannot be very easy for any chairman to do business as usual during the COVID-19 period. And given the constraints, I think they have performed really very well under the circumstances. They have themselves, of course, have a superb record as far as the effective containment of COVID-19 itself is concerned. But however, the last word on this, I think, pandemic has not been said. It is something which is coming in, so countries which have done very well in the first wave may not do so well in the second wave or the other way around. What is very important in this period is your reliability as a partner, as a responsible player, transparency in the way you deal with other countries. I think that has really been the most important aspect in terms of how we deal with countries, it's come about due to the COVID-19. So India itself, has been in the forefront of medical diplomacy during this period. I think we have, in fact, exported or donated essential medicines to about 150 countries in the world without any discrimination. And this has been part of our general attitude, which looks upon the whole world as one family, which is encapsulated in the Sanskrit phrase Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means the whole world is one family. And as far as the vaccine development itself is concerned, now there's a lot of, I think, vaccine nationalism which is going around. In India itself, we have 3 vaccines which are in advanced status as far in terms of the human trials are concerned. But we are working very closely with the WHO in terms of their own vaccine initiatives and bilaterally with many countries in the world. And wherever a vaccine is produced, I think they will all look upon Indian production facilities to be able to actually do their supplies to many parts of the world, like in Thailand itself. So I think, some countries have taken advantage of this situation to be aggressive and to be very assertive in many parts of the world, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, which I think, is not reflective in terms of a responsible leadership or being a reliable partner. I think I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jan Kisra, before you answer, I'll just say that mainland Southeast Asia has stood out during the COVID-19 period as having very low infections. If you look at the coronavirus table, the table, I mean, until Myanmar's recent surge of infections in August, this region is probably the lowest in the world. Laos, Thailand, Vietnam. And Vietnam also, they have put a lot of resources into this year as chair of ASEAN. I think they feel I've participated in a number of online virtual platforms, conferences, and workshops with Vietnam kind of organize issues around ASEAN and beyond, US, China, and so on. And they feel a little bit cheated this year. They feel a little bit cheated. It's like they have, they're ready, they're prepared, they got the resources, they got the people, and everything. And this year's going by, and we will have at least 1 full year of pandemic effects in place. Please, Ambassador Schmidt.
Microphones on. So do we. I mean, we're holding the presidency in the EU, the Council, and we had very different plans for our presidency as well, and we have to shelve them all and deal with the consequences of the pandemic. So I feel for Vietnam. I know exactly what it feels like. The colleagues in our capitals and in Brussels and in Europe worked very hard to put up an agenda, which then had to be changed according to the emergency. So I feel for them and I sympathize with them.
Thank you. It's very unlucky in that way. Ajahn Kasira, ASEAN thrives, ASEAN exists on having meetings. You know, I mean, as opposed to all the other EU, all the other international agencies and bodies and organizations, ASEAN is all about meetings. And the meetings, you know, it can lead, most of them don't lead to anything much, except a lot of statements and so on, but few can. And without these meetings this year, I really feel, you know, even from a think tank frame, that it's impeded ASEAN's work, and it has added to the challenges from outside. What do you think of the Vietnam chair and the whole South China Sea, China, and so on, to the question, Ajahn Kasira?
Of course, ASEAN thrives on meeting, and this has been slowed down by the COVID, especially the talk on the COC. I mean, there have been some online virtual meetings laying down some groundwork, but like even the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Vietnam, they accepted that some of the sensitive issues, they need like a kind of face-to-face sit down to kind of like iron out the details a bit in the COC, because it's legally binding now. So Vietnam is quite in a difficult position because it has to be careful not to be seen as kind of exploiting the chairmanship to serve its national interests. So overall, it has to act as a kind of coordinator of all the common interests of ASEAN as well. So in the end, we might have some statements that might be watered down because of the lack of face-to-face meeting. But I think they would very much want some concrete products out of their chairmanship as well. Like, for example, I mean, like in Thai chairmanship for the time before the most recent time, 12 years ago, it was also very careful to kind of issue, I mean, and claim that the ASEAN Charter, which is also legally binding, is the product during the Thai chairmanship. So it's kind of things like that as well. But the point is to keep things moving along, right? Especially on such difficult issue as the COC. It doesn't really matter, like we don't have to like depend all on who's the host or something like that. Like for example, what that has been quite successfully achieved in terms of stabilizing the situation as well was when Thailand and Singapore was successively country coordinator for China. So I mean, regardless of who was the chair at that time, it's all about other member countries in ASEAN's contribution as well. So the most important thing is, which is I think the common interest of all the hosts as well, but also other players, is to keep channels of communications open with China, stabilize the situation, and to communicate, keep communicating that unilateral actions will be frowned upon. It is not acceptable.
Thank you very much. I'll just take this as a quick last round before we come to time. If there's any question or comment from the floor, there's a question online that I'm going to address in a minute. I'm not going to convey in a minute. But any other question? Gwen Robinson, Senior Fellow of ISIS. And then we have another student.
Thanks, Ajahn.
We'll take both. Go ahead.
Got it. Thanks, Ajahn, and thanks to everyone for a fascinating look at some of the strategic thinking behind what we're seeing evolving in the region. Actually, one thing that really struck me, as you all pointed out, a very strong rising interest in the region and evidenced by these new efforts by European countries to draw up strategies. But having actually read, for example, the French strategy and really monitored what's coming out of Brussels, and now reading in the process of the German strategy, and also comments from other European countries, it seems to me that the priorities are so different already. So the German one is really emphasising things like climate change as a big security issue, whereas the French one is far more robust and the focus is really on security per se. I'm just wondering if there's any thought in Brussels or amongst these individual countries to actually have more of you had a European common strategy, and what comes next with all these rather, I'm not saying competing, but they're they're kind of rather diverse. You know, what becomes of these if each individual European country has its own specific priority? It's a bit of a vague question, sorry. You can answer it how you want, but maybe perhaps the German ambassador.
Let me ask a student to pose the question first, and then we'll come to the panel. But that's actually, it's a good question. I mean, if different EU members like France, UK, and Germany, they have different thrusts, different aims, priorities, then what would then become the EU priorities because of these different members?
Good morning, all excellencies and our beloved professors. So I have
Tell us your name first.
My name is Kasidet. I am also like a fourth-year student here. So I have two questions. So for the first one, for the ambassadors, Suchita. So regarding the issue, the clash between China and Indian dispute in terms of border, like since 1975, I heard that there was a recent clash in June 2020, right? So and you also mentioned that India has a really non-aligned movement, and you do not use the Indo-Pacific architectures as a containment China. And I really want to know that how can you deal with the disputes between China and India? And for the second question, I want to know the response from the ASEAN, that how ASEAN look at the Indian from ASEAN perspective, because we all know for EU response from EUs and ASEAN, and I want to know your for the Indian. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're coming to time, so I'll just take a quick kind of go through maybe from Ajahn Kasira this time, 1 or 2 minutes each. There are several questions. I mean, one also online, and I would need to mention from Dr. Apichai Sanjinfa. He asked about Thailand and so on, but I think this is more about the EU, Germany, broader. But there's the valid part of the question is about, you know, in talking about EU being values based. In Southeast Asia, you have this competing trends of democratization, pluralism, vis-a-vis authoritarianism. And it's not just in Thailand that the battle is taking place, but also across the region. You know, if you have anything to say about that, you can. There's a question about different aims of the different countries. What would then be EU priorities? And then, you know, China, India, and ASEAN, India. So, Ajahn Kasira, perhaps a minute or two from each of our panelists. You first.
I think you have to pick and choose here, maybe. So for ASEAN India, I think ASEAN, of course, value India a lot. And I think we have a forum maybe in BIMSTEC as well, and of course ASEAN plus 6. So we want to continue that in the future. And of course the diverse maybe of the French version, maybe German version, is because maybe they have different interests, strategic interests as well, seeming that they have some populations also living there.
Thank you very much for the question that you posed. India and China are really two civilizational entities. We have had thousands of years of a very strong relationship, mostly cultural, philosophical. But since the 1950s, we also share a boundary, which was not there earlier, because we had Tibet between India and China. So now we have 3,400 kilometers of boundary, which is not demarcated. There have been differences in the perception of our boundary. And in 1962, we actually had a border war, which India lost. So that is sort of, has become an indelible on the Indian psyche. So for several decades, our bilateral relationship, was, I would say, moribund. Until 1970s, late 1970s, again it revived. And in the 1986, we decided to sign what is called the Peace and Tranquility Agreement, which later on in the 1990s, several follow-up agreements were signed on how to deal with the border situation. So basically what happened was that the border was put on the back burner, and we decided to go ahead in terms of normalization of our relationship. They are one of our top trading partners. We have a lot going in terms of our bilateral relationship. However, the boundary, because of the difference in the perception of where the boundary lies, there have been border skirmishes from time to time. But it was in June 2020, what happened was that we also have an agreement about not having firearms carried by our border patrol troops. Both sides have been abiding by this agreement. In June 2020, what happened was that there was a border patrol party which went from on the Indian side, and they found that they have there are attempted transgressions from the Chinese side. The Chinese side came, and there was a sort of face-off, a very violent face-off, and 20 of our soldiers died in that. It's a very harsh terrain, a very difficult terrain. So this was indeed a terrible thing to happen, especially as we are, dealing also with the COVID-19 crisis. Naturally, no government, certainly not a democracy like India, would ever give up its responsibility of defending our territory. So we took action accordingly. We have several mechanisms bilaterally for discussions to carry on. So we've had discussions at the ministerial level, including in Moscow, where our ministers were there for a Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. We've had meetings and talks between our two defense ministers. We've had telephonic conversations. We have a working mechanism at the Director General level, which meets from time to time, and also a senior commanders mechanism, which meets. So the 7th round of talks took place for de-escalation and for disengagement. Now the process of military disengagement is a very complex one. It doesn't happen overnight. So there are many processes, and the Chinese have massed huge number of troops in that area. They have very sophisticated weaponry. They have tanks. They have advanced aircraft. So they will have to take the steps, and these details have been working out. At the same time, our leadership has been meeting. We've had bilateral summits, informal summits over the last few years, and that engagement carries on. So whatever our differences are, we would like to resolve them through our bilateral engagement, and we have several mechanisms which are still ongoing to deal with that issue.
Ambassador Tapiola, so what would be the EU priorities among the priorities of member states?
Well, I think there are two questions. One is the values in ASEAN or values working with this part of the world. And I think that from that I can easily then move to the other side. First and foremost, I'd want to define the issue of values, because you have to look at European history. And for us, values are not something very sort of up there and vague, but they're very concrete. I mean, we have had history of bloodshed, dictatorship, some longer times ago, some shorter periods ago. If you look at, for instance, our Central European member states, we've had geopolitical competition, we've had hate, and we've seen that for us, a value-based Europe, a Europe based on democracy, human rights, rule of law, became a question of survival. It became a question of economic prosperity, and it became a question of stability, and a question of maintaining human life, let's be honest. So you'll have to see that when we start looking at a value-based policy, We don't sort of go and lecture. We're in fact very pragmatic, but we want to see societies which bring stability and prosperity. And we believe, and we continue believing, that these values which I've just enumerated are those which bring you that stability best. Now we are seeing this a bit under challenge, and I meant we talked about systemic rivalry, because we're seeing that prosperity is now being formed in other ways as well than through democratic governance. I still maintain that it's maybe not as sustainable in the long run, but that issue is still there. So there's another level of values, and that's global governance, the multilateral international order, the questions of climate change, which are existential for us. So I'd say that what we have to balance is our relations with something which is happening inside a country and our relations with that country as an actor in the multilateral rules-based international order. And where are we value-basedly like-minded? And I think that that's a balancing act which we have to go case by case per country, which we have, because fundamentally we have an interest in seeing that the world is governed in a way which is better for the planet and better for all the citizens. And this takes me to Gwen's point. I don't see a contradiction. I mean, the Indo-Pacific was seen, and I quoted Ajahn Titinan earlier, was seen very much in a security policy tensions point of view from the beginning. And I don't think it's very surprising if the member state which first came up with an outlook focused on the security policy side of that. We are a security policy actor as the EU, and I have to say that one of the big things I've been working on in the last couple of years in Thailand has been to underline our interest in being observers in the working groups of the ADMM, plus to underline our security policy credentials. We have a agreement on contribution of troops with Vietnam for international crisis management operations. We are working very actively on these viewpoints. So security will be very important. And it's not sort of, we are Martians too. It's not just the Mars and Venus sort of questions which you get here. At the same time, the issues which come across in the German paper, and where security, by the way, is one of them very strongly as well, but which are about the global governance and about the rules-based international order, climate change, others, they are equally important. And maybe at this moment even a bit more important, looking at the challenges which our planet is going into. So my answer to you, Gwen, would be you will have it put in a well-measured cocktail shaker, and we will see what comes out in a structured way, making sure that you have the right balance of interests coming out of there. And I think that I don't see a contradiction between these. Thank you.
Okay, in the last minute or two, Ambassador Schmidt, you may pick and choose from any other questions and issues.
Let me pick up the thread also with the strengthening human rights and the rule of law, because if you look at the guidelines, you will find a chapter on that as well. There's one thing as the EU, what we define as internally, but I think it goes much beyond that, because we have globally recognized standards and global treaties, global treaty obligations. So I always hesitate to speak about human rights as something European. Yes, they have a particular European history and a very bitter history, and as a German, I think I can tell you I know what I'm speaking about and how much suffering has been actually committed on behalf of the country that I'm representing here. We're deeply aware of that. But so many of these values, I believe, are universal values. If you look at the drafting committee and the process for the UN values. They're not Western values. You have Chinese intellectuals who were influential in shaping the declaration. You had a Lebanese intellectual who was very important in the drafting committee, bringing in his committees. You had an Indian lady who was very important in that committee and actually said, look, why do you say all men are equal, and things like that. So it's very well worth studying what happened when this declaration was written up and drafted. And yet at the same time, we have to live in the real world. Again, I'm speaking from the German experience. Our country was divided for decades. We had a neighbor which we thought was not an outside country, but in reality it was an outside country, where we felt we had enormous differences in our human rights and values approaches, and yet we had to deal with the fact that they're our neighbors and that they're there. It's a physical reality. And that, I think, you're all students of international relations, that's a reality we all have to deal with in our day-to-day dealings. Now, the other question, the different approaches and strategy, just look at the map, and again, like for a French person, it's very clear that France sees itself and has part territory in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific. Now, there might be small scattered places, but for the French, this is French territory. So they do not need to explain to their domestic audience why they need a clear strategy and guideline for that. By the way, it extends to the Caribbean as well. France also has territories in the Caribbean. For us in Germany, we need to explain to our audience what is the purpose of it. And I remember you mentioned IORA, and that we have observer status. And I was in 2017 the first high-ranking German diplomat who actually traveled to the seat of IORA in Mauritius. And people were saying like, oh, did you have fun there? What did you do? You lie on the beach or something? I said, no, it's important to show up. And IORA is the only organization that spans all the countries around the rim of the Indian Ocean, including African nations, Middle Eastern nation, India, and all the way up to Australia. And when you then look at things, what they do, they're dealing with day-to-day questions which are so important. What do you do if there's an oil spill? And it's good because it's an organization where countries that normally don't have established way of talking with one another, I'm looking at the Persian Gulf and others, they sit there and they talk. So these are all these confidence-building measures that sort of nurture a network of people who say, problems don't stop at the border. Pollution doesn't stop at the border, a virus doesn't stop at the border, many other things don't stop at borders. So we have to do a lot of convincing to the inside. We have to do a lot of convincing also maybe to the outside. I'm pleased that you mentioned that Germany is the largest bilateral donor to ASEAN. So we are here, we have quite a footprint here. We are here, and the guidelines want to say, we have a footprint here, we want to extend it. It's a commitment from our side to say, this region matters to us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Look, as a last remark to bring this very stimulating, I think even intriguing public forum to adjournment, I'll just say that in the end, we had to talk a little bit about Thailand. I think we don't have full academic freedom in Thailand, so therefore we cannot really organize events on Thai politics as such. We do a lot of international relations still, but in the end, it's still the elephant in the room, and it had to be addressed, and I think that we have covered it. If this forum were to take place in Washington, D.C. or Beijing, the content and discussion would be very different. So I'm very glad to have a kind of a organic discussion, no U.S., no PRC as such, and maybe I would like to think that there's a third way. I really am an advocate of the third way, which means not having to choose, and no PRC, no USA. So, like CPTPP is very attractive to me because of the lack of both PRC and USA. So on that note, with EU, no PRC, no USA, Germany, no PRC, no USA, India especially, and of course ASEAN. So let's hope that we can see further path ahead along those lines. Thank you very much, all the panelists, ambassadors, excellencies, Ajahn Kasira, and to all our audiences here and also online. Thank you very much.